South Glengarry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise again for the second time in the chamber to debate Bill C-10. I had the opportunity back in December when it was at second reading, and I want to acknowledge tonight that I'll be splitting my time with the member for Carleton in speaking on this issue. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-10 will be remembered as an iconic piece of legislation if it is passed, but not for the reasons I believe the government want it to. We have seen over the course of the last 7 months a terrible rollout, terrible communication, a terrible committee process, and as a result, we are here in the House of Commons in person and virtually across the country going into midnight or perhaps afterwards in desperation of the government trying to ram this piece of legislation through. I will state tonight that I have heard probably on all the issues we've dealt with here on Parliament Hill and in the House of Commons, I've heard the most from constituents on this issue with a lack of trust for this government's actions on C-10 and the actions that we've seen taken place at committee over the course of the last couple of weeks has only exacerbated those concerns even more. I have to say, there was comments made earlier about how the Minister of Canadian Heritage has handled this portfolio. I listened with interest earlier tonight when he spoke about how proud he was of this bill, how proud he was of the consultations that were done not only by himself but by his predecessor to bring forward this legislation as we've seen. I'd ask ourselves why we find ourselves in this situation. There will be university professors teaching political science students from years to come and using C-10 as an example of what not to do to build public confidence on an issue and to have a bill successfully pass through Parliament. If the consultations that took place by the previous minister and this minister were so well done, why did the government introduce a bill that when it got to committee, at one point I've lost track, I think there were amendments, over 100 different amendments that were proposed. So, well, many of them were from the industry and from stakeholders. Well, if they consulted and listened so well, why weren't they included in the first place? The minister went out several times on CTV question period was a prime example, CBC Power and Politics, for an absolutely disastrous interview. People say, well, why does that matter in terms of legislation and policy? If the minister responsible for the bill can't even go out and put a decent performance in defending the merits of the bill and certain sections and concerns, that should tell you something. Not only were those media appearances terrible in explaining and trying to justify C-10, when you have to go out on Monday morning by the Prime Minister's office and issue retractions, whoops, we didn't mean that, whoops, we need to clarify, that shows you what is happening with Bill C-10. We are here tonight, and it is an absolute embarrassment for this government. And I listen with interest my other opposition colleagues from the Bloc Québécois and the NDP that say, well, yeah, the government has done a terrible job. They didn't consult properly. They should have done it sooner. They've done a terrible job with this legislation. But we're going to back them up and make sure we get this bill passed. Doesn't matter how bad it is. Doesn't matter what's not in it. We want to pass a bill to say that we checked a box. Many of our colleagues have spoke tonight about problems and concerns with the legislation. And Mr. Speaker, I want to elaborate and be specific. And I want to take part of my time tonight to focus on an organization that is not quite popular in this country these days, and for good reason, the CRTC. In this updated legislation that we have, the government and the opposition parties have ganged up to take out the part that regulates individual content. Now the CRTC has the power to take down content from individuals, and we have no way of knowing if there were other amendments. I want to thank a Canadian that I didn't know of, but we've heard a lot of around the debate in C-10, Michael Geist. Kind of jealous of him, Mr. Speaker. He's got about 87,000 followers on Twitter now and has been an eminent voice talking about the concerns about Bill C-10. If this government were so proud of its work, so proud of the bill that we have before us, I want to read two tweets from Mr. Geist. He is a law professor and Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. I would suggest that's an expert that's probably pretty well versed in this subject. He's been following committees for weeks and weeks on end, many of those committees, meetings, being filibustered by the government. But here he said two things. The committee just passed a Liberal amendment to Bill C-10 that has never been made public. Committee is just reading amendment numbers with no information provided. Chair says he cannot give any details. Literally secret lawmaking. Follows that up in frustration right afterwards. Having spent hours watching Bill C-10 committee hearings, I'm out. MPs are voting on amendments that have never been made public. No experts to ask, no discussion, no debate. This is what Liberals, NDP, and Bloc voted for. This is not how laws are supposed to be made in Canada. I will agree with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois. The government's had 6 years to get this right. There is not an MP in this House that believes the Broadcasting Act of 1991 is still relevant in today's day and age. Back in the day when that law was passed, I was 4 years old. I wasn't watching it too attentively when it was passed under a previous government. To show you how outdated it is, I've just got to do this again because I did it last time. Bryan Adams was topping the charts. Whitney Houston, Madonna, Boyz II Men, Vanilla Ice were some of the names. And as my colleague from Kingston, the island, says, you can only listen by radio, was how you listened to those back in 1991. There is no denying that we need to update the Broadcasting Act. But I go back to the arguments that are technical and important. If this bill is so well organized, if this bill is so wonderful, why is the government resorted to shutting down committee, ramming this legislation through, putting in amendments? We don't even know what they are. The government was mocking us earlier when we were raising our concerns and frustrations about the bill and about the process. And I actually I've specified the role of CRTC, and I'll get in there in a moment. But Mr. Speaker, it's hard to know what's in the final bill because there's a gag order by the minister. I don't even know what the status of some of those parts and pieces are. Speaks volumes to this. I want to take some time to speak about the CRTC. And I've seen this before, and there's a perfect example. My colleague from Carleton is here in the chamber to speak after me. He asked the Minister of Industry a couple weeks ago about the recent CRTC decision by the Chair, Ian Scott, on wholesale internet rates in this country. They reversed their promise or their commitment to lower internet ISP rates around this country. Huge controversy, huge frustration. I've heard it from small internet service providers in my riding. I want to give credit to Burkett Foster of Storm Internet in Chesterville that spoke about this. The CRTC is single-handedly spiking the cost of internet and affordability in this country. Ask the minister about it. Totally different. Well, that's the CRTC. We're working hard, we're trying, but it's the CRTC. The same thing is going to happen with this piece of legislation. We see vague definitions like internet regulation, what it means for users, all this chaos and confusion. And the government is handing over, they are kicking the can down the road to the arm's length CRTC to make decisions based on vague wording and poor legislation. And then what happens all the time is they say, oh, that's not us, Mr. Speaker, that is the independent CRTC. I've said before in this chamber, and I will say it again, it is our job to get the details right. We all support Canadian content. The internet and the tools available to us that way, we don't need to protect Canadian content as much as we need to let it flourish. I believe in our Canadian artists. We've seen examples through YouTube. We have seen numerous creators across this country be able to use those platforms, make a living, elevate Canadian content. When I hear from my constituents, they don't want to search something on YouTube based on what the government thinks they should see. They want to do it based on algorithms that show what other Canadians and other people are interested in like-minded subjects. We've seen the success that this could happen. The government's approach is wrong. They know it's wrong. That's why they're going through a secretive committee process. They're trying to ram this through before the summer goes, and Canadians are getting more and more concerned by the day on this. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to once again put on the record my strong opposition to this bill and to this process, and as always, look forward to the questions and comments from my colleagues.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So just a quick recap here. About 4 minutes ago, the member said that everything would happen at an arm's length from the government, for the CRTC would be regulating stuff. But then just as he was wrapping up his speech, he said he doesn't want the government to be able to control what people are seeing. See, this is the problem with the Conservative messaging on this, okay, Mr. Speaker, is it's all over the place. You know, this member, you know, and I have a lot of respect for him and the work that he does in this House, but the reality of the situation is that we have a bill before us that's geared towards protecting and flourishing Canadian content, like it was doing when him and I were much younger in the early 90s. And what we're seeing from the Conservative approach to this is much like their approach to just about everything else that has to do anything else that they talk about, which is just leave it alone and let it sort itself out. And that's, you know, what they're suggesting through this. They're saying, let people ultimately, let Canadian content ultimately be found by people. But what we know and what has been proven from this legislation that currently exists and was very, really helped Canadian content and Canadian culture back in the birth of this legislation is that it did wonders in promoting Canadian culture, making sure that that Canadian content actually got out there into the public so that we could enjoy it, whereas otherwise it could have been drowned out by some of the influences from south of the border, for example.
Honourable member for Stormont-Dundas-South Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague, my fellow Eastern Ontarian, and somebody who was a former mayor. We worked together in previous work, but I will say that the people that are probably most happy with this legislation are going to be lawyers that are going to be getting rich off this in the coming years through CRT decisions and what happens. My comment, again, I said in there, what the government does, and there is a record of doing this. I've spoken this House on numerous pieces of legislation. In this case, the government does not properly define and give definition and angling. They kick the can down the road to the CRTC to interpret. It's going to end up in numerous court cases. We're going to have millions of dollars from lawyers all over this country contesting this back and forth for years to come. The only people, I'll argue that lawyers are going to be better off with this legislation and this process than Canadian artists are. There's not one member in this House that doesn't support Canadian content. It's how we do it. The internet is different than TV and radio. It is an opportunity unlike we've ever seen before. They need to flourish in this country, not be held back and be told by an arm's length or through direction of whatever means of 6 men or women on the CRTC board. We need the freedom. That freedom has worked in the past, and it can again.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable.
The honourable member for Jonquière. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's something that my Conservative colleagues seem to have forgotten, and to try to jog their memory, I would like to come back to a significant study that I was lucky enough to read at the beginning of the 2000s that seek to demonstrate what is Canadian culture in an American context. When we asked an Anglo-Canadian what is the difference between him or her and an American, they would say, my public healthcare system, and for us it's multiculturalism. If you ask the question to a Franco-Canadian, they would talk about language and culture. Now, yes, there isn't a big difference between cultural products consumed by an Anglophone Canadian and an American, but there's a fundamental difference for Quebecers, and what C-10 comes to do is, in amongst other things, protect, because that's what people from the cultural sphere are asking of us, protecting this unique Quebec culture. And I am frankly surprised that not a single Conservative seems to have realised this.
Dundas-South Glengarry.
To assure the member, when we talk about Canadian content, that includes Anglophone and Francophone content in every part, in every region of this country. But I have to give the Bloc Québécois a bit of a shot here. Different times today and over the course of the last few weeks, they've criticized the process and said, well, yeah, the government has really bungled this. They didn't consult properly. There's a lot of things that we would do different. And yet we're going through a process in committee where there's secret amendments. We don't know what's in the details of them. We can't discuss them. It's absolute chaos. There's total uncertainty, and they're trying to ram this bill through. Again, I go back for the sake of a check mark. This legislation is not the way things should be done. I believe artists are embarrassed about the way that it's rolled out over the course of the last few months. And I will say, with all due respect to the Bloc Québécois, they have aided this process, not helped make this bill any better.